And that's when the police entered the house, and one of the children demonstrated the demonic activity by placing a poster right in front of a cross. And then in front of everybody, including the police officers, these 3 scratch marks appeared right on the poster. And then the crucifix fell off the wall, and in its place was a red dark stain. I just want to say that this scary, intense story is based on something that scares all of us. But remember this, right when you think that this story is over, it's not. And then right when you think it's over again, it's not. So you need to watch this one to the end and share this, please. So this evening started like any other regular evening in the early months of 1990. Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro was an 18-year-old student there, and she had always been this vibrant and lively girl, but something now had changed. You see, her family began at first to notice these subtle little differences that were very unsettling, and her mother, named Conception, would later say that Estefania seemed very distant and almost detached from reality. It was literally as if something had reached inside her and snatched her spirit away. But at first, they kind of just dismissed it as stress. After all, every teenager goes through phases. But this was something far more sinister. And there is a movie that this is about also that I'm going to tell you at the end. But until then, I'm going to play certain parts of that movie to complement the story. And the first, real sign that something was wrong came late one evening when Estefania woke up in the dead of night just screaming. So her mother rushed into the room only to find her daughter in a state of horror, her eyes wide open and just looking at the ceiling.
They're here. I see them. They're here. The shadows, they're back.
And Conception would say, shadows? What shadows? We can't see anything. But Estefania swore that she wasn't alone. She could even feel them as they touched her. These dark, menacing shapes that were just lurking right out of sight. And they would whisper to her, calling her name and then moving through her room when the lights were out. And from that night on, Estefania's behavior grew more and more erratic. She was plagued by these hallucinations of figures standing at the foot of her bed, and they were terrifying. They were of this huge black dark creature with no face. And she also suffered now from these convulsions that rattled her body violently, and uncontrollable fits of rage came out. Not to mention, and this is very scary, there were moments literally where she would bark, she would hiss, and she would growl at her younger siblings as though some beast had taken control of her body. So at this point, of course, the family became desperate, terrified of what their once sweet girl had now become. So at first, the family, turned to the doctors, seeking answers for the cause of the seizures and the hallucinations. And they ran every possible test, but the results came back on everything as normal. I mean, literally nothing. No physical condition explained the bizarre behavior that Estefania exhibited, but still, her condition then worsened. And then, in August of 1991, Estefania's body finally gave out. She was found dead in her hospital bed. Her face at that point strangely calm despite the terror that had consumed her in her final months. And of course, the autopsy report offered no closure at all. It was declared that she had suffered a sudden heart attack. But the family knew better than that. They were convinced something far darker had been at play. Not to mention, in the days that followed her death, her parents were, of course, racked with grief, searching for a reason, a cause for their daughter's rapid and mysterious decline. But it was finally then that a few of Estefania's school friends finally came forward, kind of reluctant to share what they had hidden for now so long. You see, Estefania and her friends had been toying around with something very dangerous. A homemade Ouija board constructed with clear glass used as a planchette. And it became the focus of several girls who gathered behind their school after school. According to her friends now, Estefania had suggested, using it to contact a classmate's recently deceased boyfriend. But what happened during that Ouija board session would haunt them forever. Because as they placed their fingers on it and began to just seemingly innocently ask these spirits questions, the glass started to move on its own accord, violently shooting off the board and shattering the glass. But that wasn't all. Then something truly paranormal happened. That's when this thick, black smoke hovered ominously above the Ouija board before rushing straight into Estefania's face. And then the smoke just disappeared. But at that point, the damage had already been done. And after Estefania's death, the Lazaro family was now plunged into another nightmare. The eerie occurrences began quietly. At first it was a soft voice, disembodied of course, whispering,
"Mama, Mama,"
from within Estefania's bathroom. Tell me that wouldn't scare the crap out of you. But every time they then opened the door, the room was completely empty. But then the disturbances started escalating. Literally, objects began to move on their own. Estefania's room, once kept pristine, would just be found in complete and total disarray. The bed sheets were flung across the room, and pictures were knocked down from the walls. And then the house would suddenly fill with the sounds of scratching and scraping along the walls, followed by these hideous sounds of laughter, low and cackling at first, but then quickly morphing into these wailing cries. And then, of course, lights would flicker, appliances turned on and off by themselves, doors not only open, but swung open with such force that the family was convinced someone was breaking in. And then came the thudding, loud, booming noises that echoed from within the walls as though something or someone was trying to break through. So in a desperate attempt, the family, tried to block the doors with furniture, even a large sofa. But it didn't matter. The doors would then burst again open, and heavy furniture would be flung aside like paper. And once a photo of Estefania fell to the ground with a sickening crash. And as her mother went to the ground and picked it up, she only screamed in horror because the glass had burned through, the flames scorching Estefania's smiling face right there. Clearly, this family had been through a lot, but the most chilling events were to come late at night. You see, the family started seeing it, this dark figure, humanoid in shape, creeping through the house and the halls late at night. Estefania's younger sister had actually the closest encounter.
We heard a strange whistling noise and then a groan. It was near the door, but when we looked, we saw him crawling, dragging himself across the floor. He had no eyes, no mouth, nothing, just a black head. And he came towards us, and then the toys on the shelf began flying across the room, smashing into the wall,
she said. And then the haunting spread to the others as well. Neighbors witnessed the shadows darting along the walls and objects inexplicably being thrown through the air. The Lazaro family at this point was at their breaking point. And one night in 1992, the terror reached its peak, its crescendo, you could say, as Estefania's mother woke up in the middle of the night with this overwhelming pressure on her chest, and she actually couldn't move. And that's when she felt hands that were cold and unyielding, gripping her feet, pulling her down. And when she screamed, the entire house just seemed to come alive, rattling with these deafening bangs and screams straight out of a horror movie. And finally, it was this event that forced the family to pick up the phone and call the police. And when the authorities then arrived, led by Inspector Jose Pedro Negri, they were met by a family too terrified to even cross the line back into their house. But the officers soon understood why. As they crossed the threshold into the home, all of a sudden loud bangs started echoing from the empty porch, and the air felt thick with something that was just unseen. Then, right in front of them, a locked cupboard door suddenly slammed open. The house at this point seemed to pulse with this malevolent energy. I mean, a wooden cross twisted upside down, and the metal figure of Christ was torn off from it, landing violently on the floor. And yes, this is a real story. From there, Chief Inspector Negri documented it in all of his report. And the case was unlike anything he had ever encountered or thought was possible. The haunting in the Lazaro home defied logic and rational explanation. And then, after the police visit, the family fled from the home, vowing never to return. This story was actually made into a movie in 2017 called Veronica. And it's very well shot with the cinematography. I was completely surprised. I was like, how have I never seen this? So for about a week in June 2012, there was a story about a teacher leading her students through a blood ritual that dominated the news, and people were worried about it, whether or not there was a cult in the St. Petersburg school where this woman taught, and if their children would be sucked into it. Now, Danielle Harkins will be our main protagonist without sympathy or antagonist, depending on how you feel she was mentally. And her husband George did not have a healthy marriage by any means, and she took George to court over a domestic dispute, but that was eventually dismissed. So after this, they got divorced, and some say that this may have been the catalyst of why she did what she did, along with issues of stress as well as the battle for custody she was dealing with her children. So with the stress of a recent divorce, Harkins allegedly started getting into religion. And her neighbor, Lisa Cope, claims that one day Harkins stopped by just to tell her that she was okay and that she didn't have any demons. Imagine your neighbor coming up to you and, hey, I'm okay. I don't have any demons. Later. I'd be a little, okay. And you see, Danielle Harkins was a literacy teacher working with a group of Florida teens. And on June 9th, 2012, she told 7 teens that they had demons inside of them, and that the only way to free themselves of these negative entities was to slice open their skin and then cauterize their wounds. So, as dusk set on June 9th, 2012, Harkins started a small fire near the St. Petersburg Pier. So now you have this 35-year-old literacy teacher at the Leoman and Asian Neighborhood Family Center, and she was preparing a cleansing ritual for herself and for some of her former students. So when the handful of students arrived, she told them that there were demons living in their bodies, and that the only way to exorcise them was for Harkins to cut her former students open and cauterize their wounds. And police spokesman Mike Pute said that there was apparently some chanting and then some dancing around this fire that was taking place. And then Harkins instructed the teens to slice each other open while she used a lighter to burn their wounds. And then during the ritual, Harkins used a lighter in an attempt to brand one of her former students. But after the wind blew out the flame, she decided to pour perfume on him as an accelerant, and then her plan worked when she cauterized. Now, this fire was so intense that it caused second-degree burns on the student's hand. And another student received a slash on the throat from a jagged piece of a broken bottle. Now, after cutting the student, Harkins used a burning key to cauterize their wound as well. Now, a spokesperson for the police said that the students who participated in this ritual were loyal to their former teacher and keeping mum's the word about the event. Now, the bizarre piece of this puzzle is how on board the students appeared to be with their ex-teacher doing this. Now, even though she so obviously committed ritualistic abuse, they still didn't give any information to the police about her previous activity. Now, the only student that offered anything to the press was Stephen Cantilima, who was 17 years old, and he said, "I'm fine. All I know is that she's in custody." So without any of the students coming forward and admitting to anything else happening to them, the only thing people can do is speculate on the nature of Harkin's crime. Now, in the time she had with the students, she was able to isolate and groom them into caring for her, or at least into believing all of her weird blood ritual talk. So, after the ritual ended, no one ran home to tell their parents or to go and call the police. No, it appeared as if though all the students believed that what Mrs. Harkins was saying and doing was completely normal. So after the incident blew up in the press, many of the students that were present didn't even want to talk about the ritual or their former teacher at all. You talk about Stockholm Syndrome. However, one of the students brought the ritual up to a friend after the night of the incident via text. Now, that friend immediately told their parents, who then called the police. Now, it's possible if that one student hadn't have told their friend, Harkins would have continued this pattern of abuse until maybe somebody died. Now, before Harkins was leading teenagers into blood rituals to cleanse their bodies of demonic entities, she was reportedly a normal person. I mean, she taught literacy at a community center in St. Petersburg, Florida, and was married with 2 kids. She was living the dream. But there was something awful just brewing up inside of her. So Carolyn Chance, who was the administrator at the Lealman and Asian Neighborhood Family Center, described Harkins as a very good teacher. Now, Chance said that she was very intelligent, she was very skilled, and just recently she started exploring religion. But I had no idea anything about these demons that were going on or anything like that, she said. So after the story about her teenage blood ritual got out, Harkins was then arrested on 1 count of child abuse and 1 count of aggravated battery. So she was put on leave from her teaching position and was held on a $55,000 bail. Now, at the time of her arrest, police were hoping the students who were involved in the ritual would give them more information. I mean, if they were letting her cut them up and then light them on fire, she was likely doing something else that they didn't know about. But unfortunately, none of the other teens were talking, so no one knows what else she might have been doing. And as of 2014, Harkins was released from prison on her own recognizance. So Harkins was initially charged with a felony that promised a lengthy sentence, but then the story stopped. Harkins went to prison, but it doesn't look like she did any real time. Then there were no follow-ups in the press, which means that none of the students talked about their experiences afterward. And believe it or not, some people are contributing this to the fact that they think Harkins during that time just quote-unquote had a bad week. Mind-blowing. First, we are going to start with the story of Felipe Santos, who was a Mexican living in Florida illegally. He had been brought into the country for 3 years without the correct papers, and he had been sending money home on a regular basis to support the family that he had left behind. Now, along with his 2 brothers, Felipe was in his car and on his way to work. Now, the group got into a small traffic incident while driving through Naples, causing local sheriff's deputy Steve Calkins to give him a citation for several driving infractions, all of which were misdemeanors, including driving without a license or car insurance and reckless driving. Now, having been cited, Santos was placed into the patrol car. Okay, so on hearing that Santos had been arrested, his boss had called up the local jail, to post bail for his employee. Now, only to find out that they had no record of any such arrest. And on questioning Calkins about the incident, the deputy just claimed that he had undergone a change of heart and decided to release the prisoner at a local shop before driving away. This version of events seemed to contradict the account given by another party in the traffic incident, who claimed that the lawman had been agitated about the fact that Santos did not have the correct documentation. It then took Calkins 2 weeks to submit a report about the incident, after which Santos' family filed a missing persons case in addition to a complaint about the arresting officer. And astonishingly, just after a brief investigation, Calkins was cleared of any wrongdoing. Felipe Santos, however, has not been seen since, prompting criticisms from his wife, who says she was not even interviewed about the incident. And as we move forward a few months later, another man named Terrence Williams vanished under similar circumstances. But unlike Santos, Williams was an American citizen. And this was on January 12, 2004. Williams was supposedly just alone at home, and then he disappeared. And the last person to have any contact with him was someone that lived with him, Jason Gonzalez. Now, he had a phone call with him that evening, and Williams had been invited to a co-worker's party and was driving home to prepare for work the next day. But you see, he was not in possession of a driver's license, and having been cited previously for driving under the influence, as well as this, the registration of his car had been expired. So he made the decision to drive to the party illegally, and after he didn't return home that night, Williams' roommate became concerned. He emailed Williams' mother regarding the vanishing. Now, soon after the missing persons report was filed, rather than police, it was Terrence's aunt who first found her nephew's vehicle after it had been towed away from a cemetery in Naples. The report from the tower suggested that the vehicle had been blocking traffic, a report which had been signed by Steve Calkins. After the family contacted the police with this information, it was quickly discovered that Calkins had filed no report of the incident or arrest. Terrence's family investigated further. His mother called the workers at the cemetery and learned from them that Calkins had indeed pulled the car over and asked the driver for identification. The driver, Terrence Williams, did not possess such documentation. And the cemetery workers recalled seeing the deputy pat down the suspect, who was then placed into the back of his police car. And those who were working at the cemetery that day also recalled the policeman asking them for permission to leave the offending vehicle behind in the parking lot. And then he drove away with Terrence Williams in the back of the car. A short time later, workers remember Calkins coming back to the scene and moving Terrence's Cadillac to the other side of the road, leaving the keys on the ground right next to the car. Now, with a little bit of suspicion now on the rise, the Williams family began to take their findings to the police. And they would call the station oftenly and ask to speak to Calkins. And the station contacted Calkins themselves and asked for more information about this incident. But the deputy claimed no knowledge of having had any cars towed in such a manner or even arresting anyone that day. So after this, Calkins' supervisors asked him to submit a report. Now, this report discussed the incident, including the fact that Calkins had pulled over Williams after the young man was driving, quote-unquote, in distress. And the deputy says that Williams asked for a ride to a local store and that he obliged. Now, Calkins said that he had been told that the correct paperwork was inside the car, But upon returning to the vehicle, Calkins discovered that this was not the case. So he tried to track down Williams, but was to no avail. Calkins supposedly dug deeper and found that the car had not been registered and that Williams did not work at the store as he suggested he did. Now, the police checked into Calkins' story, but were unable to find any corroborating CCTV or phone evidence. Store employees could not remember the incident, and no witnesses could be found who agreed with Deputy Calkins. Okay guys, at this point, if you think Officer Calkins is lying, then like this video, and if you think he's telling the truth, then comment telling me why. Let's continue. At this point, Terrence Williams' family lodged an official complaint against the deputy, and with no further leads and no evidence of foul play, just one missing person, it was at this point that Terrence's family were contacted by representatives from the Mexican consulate in Miami, informing them about a similar case involving the same police deputy. Then, once it had been established that Calkins had been involved in more than one such incident, the case became infinitely more complex. You had police officials checking over his interactions with dispatch, the recording showing more differences between the stories. Calkins could be heard describing the car as abandoned and as an obstacle to the road. This contradicted the witnesses' reports and Calkins' own statement. Police at this point did not know what to believe or who to believe. Calkins could even be heard joking about the possibility that the abandoned car owner could be in the graveyard, only to come back and find their car missing. But there was also language that was racist, hinting at the potential owner of the Cadillac. And just 20 minutes after this interaction, the deputy requested background information on Terrence Williams. And again, this contradicted Calkins' report that he had not even known the person's last name. Calkins, on being questioned, could not explain these inconsistencies. And after this, he ceased to be cooperative and was fired from the local law enforcement department. The two men, however, still at this point were not found. It turns out the tow company did indeed pick up Terrence's white Cadillac at the Naples Memorial Garden Cemetery on January 12th. That's when Marcia went to the cemetery and spoke with the workers there, and they told her that a cop put him in the back of his cruiser and then drove away with it. And because of the nature of this case, larger law enforcement bodies have been called to help. However, neither the Florida Department of Law Enforcement nor the FBI were able to provide any further insight. Now, what's coming next, I could have watched this to give you guys more information, but I thought it would be kind of a cool experiment for you guys to watch it and tell me what you think happened after watching it in the comments. Because there was a deposition given by Calkins in 2020 in a civil lawsuit brought by Marcia Williams, and it aired publicly for the first time on Never Seen Again, which is a new Paramount Plus docuseries about missing persons cases. And the first 2 episodes of the series are dedicated to the Williams and Santos story, and are narrated and executively produced by filmmaker and actor Tyler Perry, who had became involved in this case after seeing the TV report about it. Now, Tyler Perry said that they're both disappearing with the same deputy after being put in the same deputy's car. If this is a coincidence, then that deputy is the most unlucky man in the world. That this could actually be something that happened to him twice. I just don't see how that is a possibility. So at this point, it's safe to say that the very institution that we hope to protect us is the one that is responsible for the crime. I cannot say that without certainty, but it's been over a decade now that Terrence Williams and Felipe Santos have been missing. And even though they vanished months apart, the striking similarities between the cases hint at dark forces at work. And that includes Deputy Calkins. 13-year-old Tracy Patient lived with her parents and sisters in the Henderson suburb of Auckland. Now, on the evening of January 29th, 1976, she was going to her friend's house to play, and her older sister, Debbie, was on her way to a concert that night. So, the pair, they walked the road together, Debbie on her way to the Doobie Brothers, and Tracy on the way to her friend's house. Debbie says that as she was still walking, Tracy said goodbye and, was slightly behind Debbie at this point. And Debbie just said, "Oh, okay, bye, I'll see you later." And then she went off walking to her concert. Debbie says in a video 40 years later that she so regretted not turning around. You see, the friend that Tracy had been with, a schoolmate from Henderson High, recalled how the pair had spent the night together, gossiping about boys, including one that had given Tracy a signet ring. After that, Tracy called her mom and said that she was leaving and would be home in about 30 minutes. From there, the friends walked together halfway and saying their goodbyes at about 9:30 p.m. at the corner of Great North Road and Edmonton Road, ironically, which was then the site of the Henderson police station. But Tracy never arrived back home. And the following morning, a female doctor who was out early walking her dog just 5 minutes from the girl's house stumbled across the girl's dead body, hidden partially in the brushes in a grassy area. And Debbie recalls what happened the next morning when she, her mother, and younger sister Denise were in the living room. She said that their father came home, and as soon as he walked in, you could really see that he was upset. And so Denise said, "When's Tracy coming home?" John Patient, who was the father, while sobbing, said,
"She's not. Someone has killed her."
And as those first waves of grief just overwhelmed the Patient family in the lounge of their home that morning, police were swarming the neighborhood. Poor Tracy had been strangled to death with her own stockings, wound tight with a twig at the back of her neck. Yes, this poor little girl had been strangled with her own pantyhose. But who had seen Tracy after she left her friend's house on Chilcott Road and walked towards her home in Delwood Avenue, which is about 2 kilometers away? How did she end up dead in the lonely Waitakere Ranges less than 12 hours later? A homicide team of about 30 police officers set up a temporary headquarters in a local scout hall, piecing together her movements and figuring out suspects. For weeks, there were no leads, despite the police interviewing literally hundreds of the local men. And then a woman called a helpline for young people and said that she believed she had seen the young girl getting into a brown-colored car with a man who was in a dark suit. But the caller did not leave her name, and she also did not have any more details other than the vague ones that she had given. So fast forward to another few weeks, and this time a man called the police. Now, a sketch of the ring that Tracy had been wearing was released to the newspapers. The ring was not found with Tracy. The male caller said that the police would find the ring in a trash bin outside of a specific chemist at the nearby shopping mall. The police didn't really know what to believe, but when they got there and searched the bin, they did indeed find her ring. It was this caller who also left one other clue, but this one has never been solved. He gave the police a number, 126040. He said this number was connected to her death, and then he said he would call back. It seems like he was waiting for the police to figure out what that number meant and maybe leak it publicly before he called back, because he never did call back. And the police were never able to trace him nor work out what that number meant. Spookily, psychics were tested to see if they could determine what happened to the girl and who the perpetrator had been. That's when the greatest psychic of all, Mr. E-Files, came in, and he said, "Please subscribe now with all your heart and intent to find this young girl." That wasn't really said, but subscribe anyway. But none of them had knowledge of the case, none of these psychics, as they lived in other countries, or there was no international newspaper coverage and no internet in those days. So the psychics were given just a photo of Tracy and no further information, just to truly test them and see what they knew. And amazingly, many of the psychics gave exactly the same information. They described what activities she had been doing that evening at her friend's house, the route that she had taken home, including a shortcut that they could never have known existed, and they described the manner in which she was killed. Some of the psychics were then brought into the country and taken to the exact spot in which the young girl had been found dead, and they described the exact item of jewelry taken from her, even down to the engravings inside the ring. It's absolutely mind-blowing that they would know this. And they described the perpetrator as a man who did laboring for a job, and they said he was dirty and unkempt. But of course, they could, for some reason, not find or give his name, however. No one has ever been able to work out what the number 126040 stands for. I personally think it could have been his birthday, or his birthday mixed with something else, which would have either been December 6, 1940 or June 12, 1940. But now I'm going to tell you my personal thoughts on the research that I've done about this, and I'm going to give you 3 theories that I think of who it could be. If the number 126040 was correct, I think it could have possibly been Adolf Lundenberg, aka the Santa Strangler. The only information we would need is to know if he ever went to New Zealand around that time. This would make sense because he was born on June 13th, 1926, and would have been 51 years old when committing this murder. And a new person that came forward 40 years after the crime, so this would have been about 6 or 7 years ago, said it was a person in this age range. Now, the person who came forward basically has a photographic memory, and he said that he was there that night, and he's called the police many times, but they never picked up for him. They never picked up the phone. And basically what he saw was a middle-aged man walking her into a car. That's it. But I think it could be him because, you know, as I mentioned, he was known as the Santa Strangler and strangled his victims, just like Tracy was strangled. And I know this is kind of crazy math, but if it is 126040, the 26 would stand for 1926. And the 6 would also double, representing June. And maybe that's why there's 2 zeros in it, to say there's a double reference of something. Or the zeros could mean absolutely nothing. They're just fillers. Because if you add 1, 2, 6, and 4 together, because of course both the zeros equal 0, then you would get 13. And he was born on the 13th of June, 1926. Just an interesting note. There's also Samuel Little, who confessed to murdering at least 93 women, and he started in the year 1970, so that would fall in between the timeline when this murder occurred. We would just once again need to know if he has ever been to New Zealand. I mean, his birthday was June 7th, 1940. That's only 5 days away from the code if the code was transcribed as a birthday. Lastly, I think it could have been Hayden Poulter, who was the first serial killer from New Zealand. And he would have been about 16 years old at this time, and it might have been his first murder. His birthday is August 1961. From what I found, there's no date, just August, which is weird. And in the code, there is a 6 and a 1. So if he was born on the 24th, then this code could make a lot of sense. I want your research, comments, and thoughts about who you think it could be in the comments right now. Okay, so I suffered from sleep paralysis my whole life. And at first, I didn't even know what it was. And it happened, you could say, rarely. But as I jumped into my 20s, it was happening more and more. And that's when I figured out what it was. And believe me, it is horrible. If any of you are going through this, I am so sorry. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. Now, the internet says there's no cure for it. And they say, just try to relax, and when it happens, to try to slip into a lucid dream. Well, let me tell you that it's not easy, and out of all the times I've had it, which is in the hundreds, I've only slipped into 1 or 2 lucid dreams. I mean, it's kind of hard to relax when you're paralyzed and you're focused on your breathing, and the more you focus on it, the less you are breathing, and you feel like this would be the worst possible way to die. Most of the time, I could open my eyes a little bit. And at first, when it started happening, I was almost thinking it was like a mind trick, because I would feel my eyes open a little bit, but I would be seeing things that weren't really there. And then when I would finally pop out of it, and I'd be like, okay, wait a minute. I remember seeing, that blue light of the clock and stuff, so was everything else that I saw real? And it took me a while to realize that I just had to suffer through it and try to find, little ways like touching my fingers together, rubbing my toes together to try to wake up. At least that's what they tell you to do online. And sometimes it worked, but most of the time it didn't. But about 3 years ago, I had this stint, you could say, for 6 months where I got sleep paralysis every night. And you guessed it, it was the worst 6 months of my life. Now, during these 6 months, I had multiple crazy experiences, and I'm just going to focus on 1 or 2 of them in this story. In horror movies, like that movie Lights Out, where you see a black shadow, the lights flicker, and then it's closer. The lights flicker again, and it's even closer, and closer, and closer. Well, that's what happened to me, and it was absolutely terrifying. Okay, so it was a typical night where I expected the sleep paralysis to happen, and I absolutely did dread it, but I was about 3 months into this every night sleep paralysis time, so I was just hoping that it wouldn't last long tonight. Or maybe I would get a reprieve and it wouldn't happen at all that night. But it ended up being one of the worst nights ever. Okay, so I fall asleep, and that's when I wake up about an hour and a half later. And that's when it happens that my eyes start to open and I realize I am absolutely paralyzed, can't even move a finger, I can barely breathe, and it literally feels like there's a 50-pound weight on my chest. And now, even though I love the paranormal, in these situations, I would always try to just focus my eyes to the clock, and that's what I did. I saw this little blue light of the clock, and I would try to make out what time it was, and from there, I just kept telling myself, wake up, wake up, wake up. And this was a long one. I could tell sometimes they lasted 30 seconds, which felt like minutes. Other times they lasted minutes, which felt like hours. And very rarely they lasted what I thought at least to be about 30 minutes to an hour. And that felt like days. So, like I was saying, this was a rare longer one where regardless of what I was thinking and saying in my head, I just couldn't snap out of it and I couldn't move. And that's when it got harder and harder to breathe, like it usually did. But this time, I did something that I never usually did, and that was I looked to the left. Now, I've heard of people seeing things in sleep paralysis, whether it be, ghosts or alien abductions and a bunch of other stuff as well. And what I saw was almost exactly what I thought I would see at that moment, which is really weird. It was a black, evil-looking shadow that resembled a human being. Now, my adrenaline instantly started elevating, even more than it already was, and it just made it even harder for me to breathe. So I closed my eyes, and I said it was just a shadow from something. I don't usually look over there. When I open my eyes, it's going to be all gone. So then I start to squeak my eyes open, little by little. And as they're about halfway open, I see the exact same shape The exact same ominous, dark shadow, but now it's at the side of my bed. And I start, for the first time ever, to get extremely scared during sleep paralysis. I mean, I'm always scared, but never like this. Never. You see, at the time, I was sleeping at my parents' house, and at least I thought during that moment that my door was being opened. And I thought maybe my mother or father heard me trying to wake up, and I know that sounds silly, but at the moment, that's what I really thought. So the door opens, but I don't see anything or anyone opening it. And then I immediately look back to my left where that thing was standing near the bed, and I don't know how, but now it was right in front of me, no more than like 3 feet away, basically sitting on me. And the strange thing is I couldn't see its face, even though it was so close to me. It was so dark, but I could see the hands. And in the hands, it was like something you would see out of a horror movie. They were like this dark green and kind of veiny. And the hands had these like long nails that did not look like they were from a human, mind you. They actually didn't. They were like more pointy, if that makes sense. So at this point, I start internally screaming for it to get off me, and go. And I look back at the door, and now the door is closed. And in my head, I'm like, is all of this just me imagining this? You know, I really didn't know what to think. So as this thing is on top of me and its hand starts to reach towards my face, my heart just starts pounding and pounding and pounding. And I'm telling myself more than I've ever told myself before, wake up. You gotta wake up now. And I closed my eyes and didn't open them again until I actually did pop up from bed a couple seconds later, finally able to move. Now, nothing was in front of me or behind me or in the corners, and the door was still closed. So I started, moving my legs around, and I took a drink of water, and I was so tired, as I usually was when I woke up from sleep paralysis, but this time I did not want to risk going back to sleep. So, do I know exactly what it was? No. But I do know one thing. It wasn't the last time that I saw it. Okay, starting to get the chills, but this was my second time and maybe the more extreme time that I saw this entity. And it was when I fell asleep in the living room on the chair. I was leaned back reclining after watching a movie. Now, I'm not going to overtell these stories for you in a dramatic fashion. I'm just going to tell you exactly what happened, and that's it. So I fell asleep in the chair, and I woke up a couple hours later, and I could tell it was a very bad case of sleep paralysis, just because of the way my neck was laying so far back from being on the chair the way that it was. I was like this. I was like, oh, I can barely breathe. So I knew it was going to be a hard thing to wake up. And that's when things kind of started to go off the rails. Now, I could have swore that I actually moved my neck up a little and was almost awake, opening up my eyes little by little in the living room. And right in front of me, standing almost right above me, I saw the exact same creature, whatever it was. And I saw the arms again, and immediately I got terrified. Now, I don't know if this next part was a lucid dream or an out-of-body experience or real or whatever, but basically this thing grabbed me by the foot and I fell to the ground from the chair off the side of it, okay? And it literally, when it had me by the foot, I start clawing my way to a door that was about 4 feet away from where my parents were in. And I swear to you, it looked so real. Everything was so vivid, and at this moment, I could see the black shadow creature pulling my leg, and I'm still grasping at the floor, pulling myself inch by inch closer to the door until I actually do get to the door. And I'm laying on the ground, and I just start pounding on the door with my right hand. And I just keep pounding on that door, and I'm screaming for help. And I keep saying, help me, help me. I truly thought I was awake at this point. And I just keep knocking on the door while on the floor and screaming for help, but nothing ever happened from there on. That's when my body popped up and I was still in the chair. My body immediately jumped up, like I got shocked, And I looked to the left and the right, and then I held my chest because it was bad. And then I took a look at the door, and I'm like, wait a minute. I thought I was just on the ground. What's going on? Now, that was probably the scariest night of my life. And after that, I did hours and hours of reading and research on sleep paralysis and how to avoid it. And basically, after a while, the only thing that would basically help me was sleeping at a 45-degree angle so my head was up high. Believe it or not, that kind of stopped it. At least either that or for some other reason it just stopped. And I still to this day get sleep paralysis, but once again, we're back to that rare stage. It's rare for me to get it, which I am so thankful for. Now, can I tell you 100% that what I saw was real? No. But can I tell you 100% that what I saw was purely my imagination? No.